Good evening, everyone. That's how I get somebody to be quiet. No. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We're really excited to have Dr. Logan Miller back with us to give us an update on what's been happening out at the Noble-Wieting. I always get that wrong. The Noble-Wieting site here in McLean County. But before I turn the program over to him, I do want to thank our live stream sponsor, WGLT, Bloomington Normal's public media radio station, part of the NPR network. We're thrilled that they are sponsoring our live stream this year so that we can help bring this program to people who can't be with us physically or no matter where you are. And also, to allow us to record these programs too. That way, if you missed something and want to go back, you can watch it, or you just didn't have time to tune in, you can watch it. But as a note, this program is being live streamed and recorded, so if you don't want to live on the internet forever, mind your P's and Q's tonight here in the courtroom. But without further ado, super excited, like I said, to have Dr. Logan Miller here. He teaches at Illinois State University and also leads the excavations out of the Noble-Wieting site here in McLean County. And it's been 4 years since we've had him back because COVID shut the world down, changed things around. So I'm sure there's been a lot happening out at the site since we had him back in February of 2020. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Logan Miller.
All right, thank you, Candace. Okay, well, look at this. Very good, lots to live up to already. All right, you're excited. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to everybody online, wherever you are, for joining us. That's very exciting. So first and foremost, I'm up here getting all the credit, but this is very much a we project, a team project. So we've got a big thank you slide at the end, but I've got to thank, of course, all of my colleagues that are involved in this, and they've made a bunch of the maps and the images we'll throw up there. The students, of course, they're the ones that do all the actual work. I tell them it's a good learning experience, and they go off and go and get all dirty and sweaty. But that's great. And of course, the institutions that have supported us, such as ISU, and representatives from 17 tribal nations who have stuck with us through the years of this project and consulted on a number of things. So I get to be, I guess, the messenger of all of that, but it is very much a team effort through all this project, right? And also other people in the community, right? Some of which have shared some images here, so we'll start this off. What we're seeing here is close to 100 years ago, we take for granted that it's easy to get a satellite image or a drone image of the landscape these days, but it's a very recent kind of a thing, right? So right in the center here, right under the inn, and above this big tree, Noble-Wieting exists right about here. You see the village of Heyworth off in the distance. We're looking south, some gravel pits over there to the side. The tree line here that you kind of see a little farther in the distance is the Kickapoo Creek. And Noble-Wieting is up kind of on the, you can't really see elevation here, but it's up on kind of the first elevated area above the creek, because obviously last thing you want is to get your house all wet if things kind of overflow there, right? But a little bit more about it. So that's kind of how it looks today. Still very much looks like an agricultural landscape out there. We're in a field that's corn or beans, depending on the year. But thanks to my friends down the road in Champaign, we have this wonderful map from below the ground. So that's what you see on your left here. And anything that's kind of black or darker is something that is of interest to us archaeologically. So this is made from a machine called a magnetometer. What it does is it measures really subtle magnetic differences in the soil. And luckily for us, things that have been burnt or have a lot of decaying organic matter in them show up and light up on the machine. So what you'll see, there are about 40 or so rectangles. Those are the foundations of houses or other buildings. The above ground stuff has gone away. But about a foot or so underground, everything looks essentially as it has for the past 700 or so years. So we have houses, the smaller dots that you see pointed out as pits there, those probably started their life as storage for corn, beans, and squash. We have farmers, of course, in the area here. And we like to point out that we have the oldest beans and the oldest corn in the county, probably the oldest squash too, although we haven't run a date specifically on that. I should do it just to be able to say so, right? But those probably start off storing food. They eventually end up as trash pits. We love trash as archaeologists, right? Because that's what's left behind. That's how we can piece things together. So things make kind of a round, not quite circle, but oval-ish outline. The center was open space. You see there was a mound here. This is kind of the village cemetery. Right smack dab kind of in the center of all experience there. The thing that really shows up, the access road at the top of the image there, is just the divide between the fields. And there's probably a bunch of metal in there from relatively recent things. So there's a little bit of a tour of this site. Again, the Kickapoo Creek is off to the what will be your right and the bottom of the screen here. And this whole area is about 6 acres or so, so fairly sizable plot out there. What we have, we're looking at about 1300 AD, so about 700 years ago. And, they don't really make 700-year-old villages any longer, of course, right? And so each of these is special and unique, and there are some others. We've got some maps over here of other sites that are within about this time period in the map on the right, give or take 100 years on either side. So everyone is unique and special and important and worth preserving. But even among very unique, special things that are 700 years old, Noble-Wieting really stands out as extra special and extra unique for 3 kind of main reasons. One is that it is kind of out here, and no offense to us, but kind of out here in the middle of nowhere, right? Whereas most of the other sites here tend to be along like the Illinois River and other kind of bigger tributaries of that. And no offense to Kickapoo Creek, but I could throw a rock from one end to the other, and I'm not much of a baseball player, right? So smaller area, so kind of an out-of-the-way place, right? Which is interesting. Whereas everybody else generally is sticking along the river. There's a few other outliers out there. The other thing that we have here is that we have 2 kind of different types of pottery. And generally everything at this time is handmade, of course. You're learning from your friends, your family, from people around you how to make things in the tradition as to how they've been made for a long time. We as archaeologists look at this and we give them names just as ways to kind of help us understand and sort through this is similar to this or that. They probably have some sort of social reality, right, in the sense that you're learning from the people around you, but how exactly that translates varies from kind of time to place. But here we have 2 types of pottery that we give broad names to. Most of it is what we call Langford, and the other sites that we find a lot of Langford pottery are up north, up around the Big Bend of the Illinois River, Starved Rock area, and beyond. That's what most of the cooking pots and storage pots and things that are left behind that we find here at Noble-Wieting fall into this Langford category. But we do have a sizable percentage, maybe a quarter of the pottery, looks more like the stuff we find in kind of the central Illinois River Valley. Over here we call this Mississippian. And so they're made in slightly different shapes and slightly different styles and materials through there. But there's enough of this Mississippian stuff that we assume that people who were making that pottery were living here at Noble-Wieting. It's not just 1 or 2 things that you may have traded in. There is a wide variety of it kind of throughout the site. So this is getting to the second kind of important thing about the site, and that is people who used to presumably live kind of far away from each other have decided to move to this kind of out-of-the-way place. Because if you look at this, you say here Mississippian village, here are Langford villages, there's kind of a gap right in between. Prior to Noble-Wieting, for whatever reason, folks were kind of keeping their distance from one another. But we have living side by side here, Mississippian and Langford people who are making those types of artifacts are here at Noble-Wieting, which is fairly unique among other villages for this time period. The third thing that's super unique about this, and we'll talk more about all of these later. Third thing that's super unique is that folks here were eating a lot of elk. And basically since the end of the last ice age up until very recently, the thing that people were eating and hunting a lot of were, of course, deer, right? So when you think of wild animals out there, deer is the big one. Well, back in and around 1300, there must have been elk somewhere nearby. That's one of the enduring mysteries, I guess, we're trying to tackle here. But we have a heck of a lot of elk bones, I guess, that are coming up out of the site, which is very, very unique, right, as I say. So those are the three things that really set it off, even, among things that are 700 years old, and it's all unique, and it's all very, very special, right? Okay, one of the other things, just some other background information, one of the things that people always ask me is, how do we know this village was here, right? And how do we know there aren't other villages out there that we haven't come across yet? Well, nobody necessarily went looking for Noble-Wieting. It's just kind of made itself known a long time ago. Here's some folks from this institution out there about 100 or so years ago. You can't tell where they are, but they tell me that's where it is, right? The major work was done by my predecessor at ISU, Dr. Ed Jelks. There he is on the left with some middle school students from back in the 70s there. Rose Schilt, who you see on the right, actually wrote this up for her master's thesis in 1977 at ISU. She went on to have a wonderful career in environmental compliance in Hawaii. She came back here from Hawaii to help us dig and also visit family. Maybe that was important too. But to help us dig several years ago. So that was a very important and interesting connection out there. So we knew a lot going into this from the work they had done many years ago, right? Okay, other things we have to talk about as archaeologists, we're kind of time traveling here, right? So the world is a very different place 700 years ago than it is today, as you can imagine. And so what is life like? We briefly talked about, we've got corn, beans, and squash. Folks are hunting elk and other things like that, living in villages. But about this time, actually a couple hundred years before this, one of the biggest things happens in this whole part of the continent, and that is Cahokia, who you see here in kind of the center of the map on the left there. Cahokia is the very first ever city anywhere north of Mexico. So just imagine you've never seen a city before, there's never been a city. It's going to make a big deal across the landscape there. So this is right about 1050 AD. Cahokia becomes a thing. All those complex arrows and other dates are just talking about the influence of Cahokia, or people moving in or out of Cahokia and spreading these ideas and practices and objects, things that we call, again, Mississippian, so going back to things that are related to what we see in the Illinois Valley over here. So it's a big deal, right? And it's a city for several hundred years, but by about 1300 AD, as you see in the image on the right, stolen from Cahokia's website, people are moving away from Cahokia, right? They're not disappearing, they're not dying off, there's not a big war, disease, or famine or anything like that. They're just choosing to move elsewhere. And as you can imagine, you've got thousands of people in a city. Just imagine if everybody in Chicago decided we're going to go live somewhere else, right? That's not going to impact just Chicago, that's going to impact everything else around it. So we see a lot of movement, we see a lot of new villages popping up, a lot of new people in new places happening as folks are choosing to leave Cahokia. And this is all related. The question becomes, why are people leaving Cahokia? Well, there's a good deal of debate about that. But what we know is that there are several things going on about this time that may be interrelated with this and will ultimately tie us back to Noble-Wieting here. One, obviously, again, we have migration. We have people moving around. Part of this is people moving to a new place, like Noble-Wieting here in McLean County. Another thing that we're going to see is that people are more interested in protecting themselves and building walls around their villages at about this time. And then the third thing that we see happening is climate change, right? So we talked about migration out of Cahokia. We also have movements of people kind of down in other directions. So we talked about Langford are kind of up in northern Illinois. Mississippian is the name that we give to people who are at Cahokia and in the central Illinois River Valley. Beyond that, up into what is today Wisconsin and surrounding areas are groups of folks that we call Oneota. Again, just based on different styles of artifacts and lifestyles here, it's just an easy archaeological way to kind of interpret these things. What we have is folks who used to be much farther up north are making their way down and settling into villages in the Illinois Valley around what is kind of the Dixon Mounds Museum and that kind of area here, if you've been there. We have a number of villages from around this time. So there's already people living there, and we have a broadly similar thing to what we see at Noble-Wieting. We have people moving down from up north, settling in new villages. So movement of people, right? There's always, if you move from one place to another, there's always certainly a chance you're going to come into contact with other people who are already there. You've got to figure out how to make that work, right? So we see this happening in a number of places. One of them is here. So people are moving out of Cahokia, people are moving down from up north and left, right, and all the others, right? So there's a lot of migration going on. Number two, again, what happens is a number of people start to at least be a little more concerned with protecting their villages, right? And so what we see, the reconstruction here in the upper left, right? This is what maybe a typical village might have looked like from this time. You have a giant wall made of like telephone pole sized posts around the village to protect from the reality or the perceived threat of anyone coming in to do you harm, right? So what we have on the map on the right, the sites with circles around them are broadly, we're looking at the entire half of the United States here now, other places around where people are building walls around their villages. If you can make sense of this wonderful image over here that condenses a lot of time and a lot of sites, for my colleagues over here, you can see that the dashed line around some of these villages, many of which date to this time around 1300, we have walls popping up around them, of which earlier villages didn't have walls around them, right? So over a really broad stretch of an area, we see people at least concerned about or wanting a little bit more protection than we had seen in the past. Third thing that we got to know about the world at this time is the climate is changing quite a bit. So here's another wonderful image that I've stolen from my colleagues here. So the closer to greens and blues means there's more rain on the images on the right, and you can kind of translate to the dates here. So as Cahokia is being founded and people are moving there, there's lots of rain, great for farming, of course. By the time we get to 1300 or so, the yellow and the red is now creeping in. So there's bigger droughts that are popping up, right? Not as good for farming, right? So we see some bigger climate change happening. A lot of the other stuff like the migrations that we're seeing seem to correlate with changes in things like rainfall and temperature that are impacting bigger areas around the region, right? So that is essentially what we have going on overall. Our overall perspective on this and what it means and what would have meant for life of people 700 years ago. This idea when you have climate change and migration and things that are pushing you out of places or pulling you to places, that creates what we call coalescence. All right, word of the day for you. Coalescence is just the coming together of new people in new places to make new traditions, make new cultures, and the like, right? This all occurs not at a big scale like half the continent, right? But it all occurs in your daily life. It occurs with you, your friends, and your neighbors, and your family, and people who are right around you, people who are in your community. So we call Noble-Wieting a coalescent community. So coalescence comes from, again, being pushed or pulled from these bigger forces like climate change. Community, though, think of your community that you're part of here, physical community, online community. First thing, you have to work to maintain those ties, right? You don't automatically become connected to people just because you live near them, right? You've got to be friendly with them. You got to ask them how their day was, right? It's constructed. There we go. Now everything's coming together. Communities, right? People are not all the same, right? We can't just talk about the villagers, right, as one homogeneous group. People have different families, we have different ages, we have different genders, we have different experiences, we have different backgrounds, right? Any group of people is going to be diverse in some way. Communities might also be spread across a large geographic area, and not just in the village itself, right? So if we think of Noble-Wieting, people are certainly going to know people and be related to people in other villages and in other places across the landscape here. And if you think of your own community, right, it's about people. It's also a geographic place. But if you think of the place that you grew up, you can probably also think of a building or a water tower or a park or something that is beyond people, right, that is also part of this, right? So these things are all different depending on where you are in different times and places in the world. But we can look at this and think about this and in very specific ways about what is happening in the past. And this is not unique to myself or anything. Lots of my colleagues are thinking about this. Here are some of the books and articles that we're taking inspiration from. Morton Village is another one of these in the central Illinois Valley that has some Oneota folks over there. So there's these broad patterns that a lot of my archaeology colleagues are thinking about, right? Because some of the big things that we're looking at are happening over big areas, but they're all playing out in different ways at different sites. And that is one of the things that we're trying to understand here at Noble-Wieting, right? So that's big picture stuff. I know a lot of background going quickly through all this, but the big question is, how does this all happen here, right? What is the community like? How were people coming together from what may have before this been folks who lived in different areas? Here's some of the ways that we can think about the different people that were at the site based on different types of pottery. We've got Langford kind of up here in the upper left here. Right beside it is a Mississippian bowl with kind of this sunburst pattern etched into it, and a few others, right? So we think about how are people making life work here at Noble-Wieting is essentially the big question that we have out there. Because finding stuff like this is super exciting, of course, but ultimately it's not about just the discovery. You've got to, if you're going out there and digging and disturbing things that have been there for 700 years, you really want to, of course, have bigger research questions about all this. So coming back to this, here is our wonderful map telling us what's going on under the ground. Just as another way to kind of look at this, again, we've got somewhere around 4 dozen buildings. We assume most of them were houses, but there may have been community buildings, religious buildings, public buildings like that out there. We have poked around in a handful of these. One of them is marked on the map on the right there, but we've excavated a house in the northern part of the village, the eastern part of the village. We're working on our second one in the southern part of the village here, and then we have one over in the western part of the village, right? So we're trying to understand a community. We've got to look at a bunch of different places. Think of any town or city out there. If you just looked at one house, you would have no idea whether that's the typical or atypical or anything like that. So we're starting to get, I think, a better picture of what's going on, and we'll build to that. But one of the other things that we also have to think about archaeologically is we see everything all the way kind of at the end, right? Everything that has happened in this place has kind of left its mark on time. One of the things that we have to kind of tease out is what happened first, what happened later. This one is totally hypothetical over here. This is just one assumption of not all the houses may have been occupied at the same time. They're made out of wood. They last anywhere from 5 to 15 years before you have to rebuild or restructure them. So even if people were only here for several decades, we can still say that there would have been some change through time, right? So it's important to remember that we're looking at a snapshot at the very end of what's going on, and we have to kind of tease out what is happening here. But in terms of the community, what were people thinking? What were people feeling? What was going on? Well, one of the things, of course, that we see from comparing to other places at this time is that a number of other villages had walls around them, right? And if you look closely at this map here, you can see kind of on the left here outside of the red, there is this line, right, of circles over here that may represent big posts that were set in a wall. And this is one of the first things that we looked at. We wanted to know, were people kind of worried about defense, and did they build a wall here? This would tell us a lot about maybe what people were thinking and feeling at the village. Well, long story short, there was no wall at Noble-Wieting. We looked over here. You'd expect, if there was a wall, you expect these to be very deep, very narrow holes in the ground, right? These were really wide and really shallow holes in the ground, right? So it wouldn't have been really great for holding up any sort of wall. So somebody was doing something over here. We call them processing pits because we're not exactly sure what was going on. And then another part of this is actually just a natural kind of drainage feature that occurred. So as far as we can tell, there was no protective wall around Noble-Wieting, right? Which is interesting. Maybe this is part of why people move so far away from others. Maybe that provided a natural level of security. They didn't feel that they needed a wall around the village. So we eventually did come up with a few little small little fence posts kind of right outside of this house here. This is on the extreme western end of the village over here. But it wouldn't have offered much protection. Maybe it was just to keep the dogs in or keep the kids from running off too far. But not much in terms of any sort of level of military protection going on there, right? So no wall around the village, which is very interesting, kind of unusual for this time. But most of the things that we're focusing on are houses, and we want to understand the daily life of people. If you're building a house back in the day, the first thing you did was dig down into the ground a little bit to create what we call this basin. And then you dig 4 trenches on the sides, and you put your walls in that, and the house kind of comes up over and above that. So this is kind of halfway through the excavation. You can kind of see how deep the basin was there. We're about a foot down into the ground. The first foot or so of soil has been churned up by 200 years of agriculture at the site. But below that, everything looks essentially as it did 700 years ago. You might be able to make out at the center some orange and red. This is where the fire pit was for cooking and for heating the house. And then you can kind of make out the darker areas would have been some of the walls of the house. The yellowish brown is the natural soil there, of which the whole place would look if no one had ever lived in this area. So the houses, they all kind of follow a general style, and we assume that they would have looked something like this. On the left there, you can see some reconstructions of the framework of these houses. They were built with relatively small saplings that would have been easy to kind of bend over and tie in place. You have kind of a curved roof over there, and then that's filled in with other branches or other things, of course, to keep the rain and the wind off of you. Now, each of the houses here have this unique aspect that involves looking at dirt, and I'm sorry, I know pictures of dirt, right? But typically when you're building a house, you dig a little basin, and then you dig the 4 trenches that would have been the foundations for your 4 walls of the house. And at other places like Cahokia and other villages at this time, those trenches are all dug in a very specific kind of manner where they're dug kind of down to the same depth. All of our trenches, or most of our trenches at Noble-Wieting, have what these pictures on the right show. There's a little blip that pops up that is the natural subsoil kind of halfway through the trench, right? We're not exactly sure what that means functionally or stylistically, but what we can say is that everybody at Noble-Wieting had in their mind, this is how you build a house, right? This is how you build a trench, right? And these are not visible. This is long before like building codes or any sort of violations like that, right? But what we have is clearly there's a shared idea of this is how we do it here at this site. And nobody, and all the other sites that archaeologists have looked at, nobody has seen people build houses in exactly this same way. Right? So we can think that's part of community and part of the things that people were talking about. If this must be how we build a house now that we've moved out here to this new place. The other thing that is very interesting is that all the houses that we've looked at that have doorways, so the wonderful kind of narrow drawings here that we've used to highlight the things that we see in the ground are the walls. There's a little gap in several of them. That gap, we presume, is the doorway. It faces that plaza where the burial mound is. That would have been public open space, kind of like the town hall, the town plaza, the town square there. They all face that, right? So everybody kind of has a shared idea of you put your front door towards everybody else, right? If you put your front door facing away, people maybe thought you were weird, right, and ask you to change it, right? So there's clearly like this social idea, maybe even social pressure to say, put your front door facing everybody else. Maybe it's a sign of, you know, we're all friends here. Let's all look after each other, right? So that's an interesting kind of a shared bit. There is some variation between the houses, as there always is. Some of them, at the end of particular phases of their use life, appear to have been burnt. So that's why you see all this wonderful dark charcoal here we're very creative, so we give each house its own number, feature 87, right? That's a very exciting one. Feature 9 is one on the northern end of the village. You can maybe make out some orange and red kind of soil there. That's because a fire has happened in this area. Now, two things can be a fire, right? An invading force that comes and burns down the village, or people who lived in the house themselves choosing to do this. As I said, we have no particular evidence that anybody was coming in and forcibly burning things down, right? And so that leaves us with this idea that it was the people themselves. So it could have been a very functional thing, right? If your house is starting to rot and a wall is starting to move over, maybe you just knock it all in and burn it rather than hauling stuff away. Related to that, or potentially alternative to that, there could have been a very special moment, right? When you're moving on from this phase of the house, that could have been part of the process of either rebuilding or moving somewhere else where you kind of symbolically burn the house from here, right? But we know that a couple of the houses, not all, 2 of the 4 that we've excavated have been burnt. 2 of them were not burnt. Here's one that's on the east side of the village, right? So we have 4 walls. There's this stray wall over here. Ignore that one. That was something going on inside. But 4 walls of the house, there's no gap. If it looked like the other houses, there should have been a gap right here. So that's a little different. We don't know why, but we've seen some variation here. This one doesn't look like it was burnt. And this photo hopefully is showing up better online. But right about here, we have this kind of special Noble-Wieting construction technique that is happening over here. All right. Feature 87 is one of the houses that we've excavated on the south end of the site. This one was very much burnt. It also didn't appear to have a front door to it. It had this interesting pit inside here that had a bunch of elk antlers and corn cobs at the bottom of it over there. We will soon be done with pictures of soil here soon enough, but here's how it is. So just a little bit of variation out there. Okay, so one of the things that people did when they were ready to kind of move on from one particular phase of the house is maybe you burn it, maybe not, right? But the other thing that we see in what we call these wall trenches, so kind of the outer walls of the houses here, is we find these beautiful stone axes. There has been one in the wall of each of these 3 houses that we've excavated, right? So if you find one of these left behind in a wall, it appears to be straight up and down near the top of the wall, very much like someone put it there just late kind of in the life of the house, right? If you find one of them, then you can say, oh, maybe somebody forgot it. But we're finding one in every single house. And so it's very much a pattern, right? And so it very much also seems to be something that people are doing, where you would leave behind this axe, right? Maybe this axe was used to chop the wood to build the house, and so there's a thought that it has become part of the house. There's lots of different, specific explanations that we might be able to come up with this. But we see this as a broad community pattern that when you are transitioning from this stage of the house, you leave behind the axe, right? And these are very hard to make, a long time to make. You're basically using natural sandpaper to kind of grind these down to a nice sharp point. That would have been a really valuable thing, right? So to leave that behind must have been a very big deal. So 3 of the houses we've excavated have the axe in the wall. And so as we're digging the walls here, which can be, a lot of work, that's one of the ways to motivate students is we'll say, well, you're going to find an axe somewhere out there, right? So we're digging feature 87 on the south end of the site, and it's hot, right? It's the summer, and I keep saying we're going to find an axe. So one of the students hits this rock right here, and they say, we found the axe, wonderful. Well, we keep poking around, and it's not an axe, right? It's a circular thing that appears to be kind of banged up. Somebody might have used it to grind up some corn or to crack open some nuts or something like that. But it's right where we would expect an axe to be, right? So there's a little bit of variation going on out there. It's only one example, so we don't quite have a pattern yet. So it could be that an axe and this type of a tool were interchangeable. There might be some houses with axes and some houses with these grinding stones. We just have to keep working and keep figuring it out. But we see this interesting thing here where this is very typical of a lot of things at Noble-Wieting. We have a broad pattern that fits most of what we see, but there's always going to be something that is the exception that kind of proves the rule, right? So here on the left here, this is one of the last pictures of dirt that I'll show you, but this is very exciting. This is what we're working on recently here. And this is what we call feature 91. It's in the southern area of the site. So on the right is this house that we've seen before. As I said, you dig a basin and then you dig your walls and you build your house in it. Most of these house basins are about 1 foot deep. This one, feature 91, is about 3 feet deep, right? And so it's 3 times deeper than anything that we have seen before. Here's where the wall would have been. So we've just gotten into a little bit of this. So I can't say a ton about it other than we have more variation out there. And again, I call these houses just to be quick with it, but this may not be a house, right? It may be some other type of a building that needed to be deeper for whatever reason. But stay tuned on that one. We'll come back with more updates as we go. Right? Okay, what about other stuff that we're finding? As I said, we have corn, beans, and squash here from the site, which of course you're going to know from Native American agriculture. But the thing with beans especially, you see up here in the left corner here, beans have not been found at any other Langford sites. They have corn and squash. There's beans in the Mississippian sites, in the Illinois and Mississippi River Valley. But beans would have been a new addition to the diet for most people at Noble-Wieting, right? So you have to understand how they grow and how to incorporate them into your food. We know food, of course, is a big part of life. So this would have been another change, right? And another part of the new aspects of community that are happening here. We've got a corn cob down here. These are chunks of squash rind. Typically, when you find plant materials at an archaeological site, they are very minuscule, almost microscopic kind of pieces. So to find big chunks like this is another reason why Noble-Wieting is very exciting. There's some more squash rind fragments over here, very big chunks. Speaking of food, as I mentioned, elk are a big part of the diet here at Noble-Wieting. And one of the things we want to understand is are elk maybe one of the big reasons why people are moving out here, right? You're moving away from other villages. Maybe it's because this is where all the elk are, right? It seemed to make sense initially that there's a lot of elk when people move off to a new place. So my colleague, Dr. Abby Stone, is an expert in these sorts of things. And what all these wonderful graphs and charts are showing us is that we literally are what we eat. And you can measure the different isotopes that are in the bone and the teeth. In this case, we're looking at strontium, which largely relates to water and the geology of different places. For our purposes, these values are going to change depending on where you are on the landscape. So you can get these readings from the teeth of elk and deer. And what we found here, or what Abby has found, right, is that this is the range, right, of generally what we would find or expect to find in the local area if you're hunting relatively close to home. So most of the deer are falling in that 2 standard deviation local range. There's a few that are outside of that. And there's a few elk that fall in that range, but many of the elk fall outside of that. And there's even one up there that falls outside of the known range for the state of Illinois. So we know that this means that people are getting elk from a wider variety of environments. Where do you find a wider variety of environments? Farther away, right? So we assume that this means that people are going on relatively long distance elk hunts. So this kind of simple explanation that people move there to be near the elk. Well, obviously people and elk, of course, are going to be savvy to this, and they may go somewhere else. But we do know, of course, that people are hunting and presumably eating a lot of elk. The environment, again, may have allowed them to go on these hunts. Maybe being farther from people allows you to go do this still, but it's not quite as simple as moving right to where the elk are, based on the isotopes here. Speaking of elk and bones, here's just a few of the other goodies here. This thing was fun. Somebody was trying to make this into a point here. They're trying to cut off the end, and for whatever reason kind of gave up in the upper left over there. Here's a portion of an elk antler on the right that was on the floor of one of these houses. Here's a very small bone, not an elk bone, but very highly polished and burnt. Might have been a pin or a needle or a relatively small item there. We find a handful of these things. The best we can come up with is some sort of a game or a counting device. They're almost like dice, right? And we find a handful of those that can tell us a little bit about some other aspects of life here beyond just eating. Other things, we get copper. Copper ultimately is coming from up north, Lake Superior region, but some of this could have been pushed down by the glaciers, especially the smaller bits over here. So it's hard to say exactly where this came from, but we have a lot of decorative things like copper beads, which you see in the bottom photos. A few copper tools. This thing is broken, but was probably something for poking holes in, say, leather items or something like that in the past. So we've got a lot of that popping out. Stone tools are the big things. When Rose Schilt and Ed Jelks were out there in the 70s, they went and talked with a number of local folks who had collected items from the surface of the site, and they counted up 3,000 arrowheads that had been collected from the surface of the village over the years. There are many, many more still out there. Here's just a small smattering of those. The reason the site is kind of elevated is because it's on its gravel deposit, so they're getting stone from right there. So there's a lot of stone, lots of opportunities for making stone tools. Many of them are arrowheads. The bow and arrow is high technology at this time. Some of them are a little bigger. On the bottom here, you see some knives, many of which are of styles that we see kind of from other sites as well. But I have been yammering on here. Let's try to kind of wrap this all up and pull it all together. Remember, our big focus is about how is Noble-Wieting a coalescent community, right? Well, again, there's climate change going on. There's potential concerns about safety going on. There's migration. People move out here to a new place. That's kind of the hallmark of coalescent communities. We have new people coming together in new places. We have this wonderful, not a perfect circle, but very much an outline of village, right, that shows that people knew not to live on top of the burial mound and the cemetery there, of course. So there's very much this cooperation in this idea of what the village should look like and where people should be. We don't have any particular evidence of a whole lot of concern about defense, and so there's no wall or palisade around this. Everybody's doors, where we see a door, they're facing other people, they're facing the burial mound, they're facing the public space of this. So we know that that would have very much been a big part of everyday life and experience here in the community. Overall, we said the houses kind of look the same, but they're all a little bit different. As you can imagine, we've got elk becomes a big part of the diet, where it's not that so at other villages. Beans are a big part of the diet that we don't necessarily see at other Langford villages, right? And a lot of this is just people taking the things that they know and things that they've learned from other places and other experiences and bringing them all together to make this wonderful new community we see here at Noble-Wieting. So here's my official thanks to all the other folks that have helped out with all of this. Sorry if I've neglected to put your name on there But I thank you as well, and thanks to all of you for sticking with me here. I do appreciate you listening to the story.
Thank you so much, Logan. We have time for some questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Wait till I get to you with the microphone so that our friends at home can hear your questions as well.
Very good.
Oh, right
There we
here,
go.
and then
All
we'll come over here.
Hi, I was just wondering if there's any connection to the Kickapoo Creek and their location there, and was it ever bigger 700 years ago?
Gotcha. Yeah. So Kickapoo Creek is there. It's hard to say exactly how similar or different things looked back then. We assume, based on the earliest kind of official maps that folks made, were a few hundred years after this. But the creek is there. There tends to be kind of wooded areas along the creek, and then the prairie is kind of farther away from the water. So the village is kind of right on the boundary of this, whether it would have been in the woods, near the woods, and then beyond the prairie is harder to say for back then, right? But in terms of the actual Kickapoo, right, and we've got other Kickapoo villages in the county here. Those are a few hundred years later after that. I would assume that folks at Noble-Wieting had moved on elsewhere by maybe 1325 or so is a nice kind of round number. So they're here for a few decades and then are moving on elsewhere. Right? That address the question? Getting on. Okay, thank you. Yes. All right, we gotta wait for the thing here. Thank you, Candace.
So what was the population at the height of its, and then secondly, then were they drawing their water probably from the creek, or are there tributaries to the creek, or are there any wells at all?
Okay, so we'll answer the tough one first. The population. All right, this is official up here, so I got to give an answer, right? Somewhere around 100-ish, plus or minus 100. Right? So 100% margin of error there. I'll cover my bases, right? So part of this becomes, well, I have to flip way back. Remember the slide that had the potential versions of the village, and maybe these houses were first and then those houses came later. So a big part of estimating how many people were there were knowing how many of these houses were occupied at the same time. And then also how many of these buildings were actually houses, and how many of them just stored corn or something like that. So it gets a little harder. You can do formulas. We are kind of working on that. There are some general formulas that kind of estimate the general amount of square footage that people generally use. Not in our kind of houses. We have super huge houses that are very different than, I don't know, traditional, I guess, kind of houses that you would look at, right? So you can do that, and you can get a very general kind of an estimate over there. But that is one of those things where non-archaeologists, if you are working with living people, you can just ask them, right? Or do a census, how many people live here. In the archaeology world, simple questions like that get to be a little bit harder to get to, but very good question. Yeah, in terms of the water, though, Kickapoo Creek probably would have been the main one. It's a little bit of a walk down there, but not all that far away. So Kickapoo, the little Kickapoo kind of goes to the north. Burleson Creek goes off to the east over there. So there's not anything necessarily running directly to the village here, but it's maybe a couple hundred yards away, and it would have been probably a big part of daily life. We talk a lot about elk. We also find a lot of fish bones here. We find river mussels from the river there. We assume, of course, people had canoes, even though we haven't found a canoe over there, and that would have been a big transportation route as well. So yeah, good question.
The water table would be higher there.
Yeah. So
what you think? Could they have just made some shallow wells? Yeah.
We don't have a whole lot of evidence for wells or anything like that. Never say never, but we don't necessarily see that. And it is a fairly well-drained area here. Again, under the soil, it's gravel. and so water, you'd have to go down through the gravel, I guess, to get to any sort of a well. And everything that we've seen stops at the gravel, and we stop at the gravel because it's a real pain to try to dig through by hand, even with steel tools these days. So maybe that would have been an impediment hundreds of years ago as well. Yeah.
Okay, I know we have some questions online.
Ooh, the online folks. All right, wonderful.
Do we want to do it? No? Oh, I thought you said we did. Oh, no. Any more questions in the room?
There we go.
Oh,
Yep.
up front.
Right, there we go.
So do you only work at the site in the summer?
Yes. Yeah, they I don't know, they make me teach these classes during the year. It's a real pain, right? No. We go out there. It's during the growing season. We're very thankful that the landowners let us go out there. They're trying to make a living as family farmers. And me and us yahoos go out there and mess things up a little bit. We try to be as targeted as possible. That's the beautiful thing about this map, is we have this tied in to GPS, and we know exactly where we want to dig and reduce any sort of impact on the site, right? But yeah, we're out there for about a month every summer. So everybody wants to see archaeologists digging, right? And that's what we always think about archaeologists doing, but the general idea is that for every hour you spend digging, you spend about 10 hours in the lab, and that might even be an underestimate out there. So we have plenty to keep us busy, even though we're just digging one month a year. Yeah.
There was another question. Oh, right here. Okay.
I was just wondering whether there's a short answer to the question, like you said, one of the special things about the site is this mixture of the two different pottery styles. Mm-hmm. So do we have other places where we find a mixture of those styles, and would there be many such places? Mm-hmm. And a similar kind of mixture, or much less?
Not so much here. All right, let me go. There's probably an easier way to get back through here, but sorry if it's causing motion sickness. But okay, so in terms of having Langford stuff and Mississippian stuff, this is the spot, and stuff is a technical term there, but it's Langford pottery now. Over here to the west, some of these villages in the central Illinois Valley, that is where folks are moving from kind of up in Iowa and Wisconsin. That's that Oneota label that we give. So there's a couple of villages where there is some intermixture of, again, broadly similar pattern of people moving down south and kind of integrating with folks who are here. But the difference being, right, that these Mississippian, as we call them, folks were hanging out here, and then people come and join the village, right? In this case, we have people consciously making a very long move from both directions, and both deciding to kind of meet up at this new place. So that's kind of the extra unique part of this.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you once again, Logan, for a fascinating program. And thank you to everyone who joined us here in the room and online. We'll hope that you come back this Thursday for our next Lunch and Learn program, where we will have Rivian here giving us an update on what's new at the plant. That program will be in person only, so come and grab your lunch, come learn a little bit about Rivian. And once again, thanks to WGLT, part of the NPR network, for our live stream this evening. I hope to see you all once again, and thank you for coming with us tonight.
Thank you.